By Susanna, Isabella, and Emily about Sudan. Take it away.
Yeah. So hopefully you guys read the links or watched the YouTube link that I sent you guys, and hopefully you were interested in what we're gonna say. And I'm really nervous, so I'm sorry if I sound awkward. But yeah, this is our presentation, Sudan, a country in political transition? Question mark. Okay, these are the contents, introduction, conceptualization, thesis. We're going to talk about a little bit of the history of Sudan before Omar al-Bashir's dictatorship. Then we're going to talk about present era, like what happened this year and a little bit of last year, starting from December. We're going to go through the timeline, analysis, conclusion. We're going to ask questions, and then we will go into the discussion. Introduction.
So many of you might have heard of what was happening in Sudan, especially because of social media, because a lot of attention was drawn to this crisis. And so Sudan is a post-colonial country that most of the population have always known to be a dictatorship, as Omar al-Bashir was in power for 30 years. He took power in 1989. And so before that, the country was faced with civil war, constant corruption, and, political and social unrest. However, the past year, the Sudanese people have expressed their desire for a change in terms of leadership, and they have been requesting a democracy. So, based on what we have witnessed over the past month, and the elements to this case, we assert that Sudan is moving towards a political transition, so that's a question we'll be answering today. And so, yes.
This is some art that we found and we wanted to display. They kind of went viral, but the first picture shows women protesting for an equal Sudan, which is a big deal because during al-Bashir's dictatorship, women didn't have a place in politics. Then #BlueForSudan went viral all over social media, and the story behind it is that a student, I think he was studying at some school in Manchester in England and was in Sudan for his summer holidays, was killed during the protesting in June. That started in June in Sudan, and when he got killed, at the time of his death, his profile picture on Instagram was blue, and so everyone started making their profile pictures that shade of blue. His name was Mohammed Matar, and that went viral. Blue for Sudan.
Okay, so for the conceptualization, our question, or I guess our discussion, what we're researching, talks a lot about democracy and authoritarianism, and the movement from one to the other, and how you define when a country is in transition. So you can go from authoritarianism, obviously the very controlling one, to a very liberal or electoral democracy. We don't really, or I guess during our research, we never really defined what Sudan is. It's not quite a democracy, but it's not really authoritarian yet. And so we just kind of wanted to put the concepts out there of what it could be, but we think that it's definitely just such in the middle of transition that we can't really define what it is right now.
Okay, this is our thesis. So given that there is a new sense of nationalism, a very young population, and the ability to share the protests with the world, are these reasons enough to ensure Sudan effectively becomes a democracy rather than sliding back into an authoritarian regime?
Okay, so this is the historical timeline. There's a lot of words up here, I know. It's just, I wanted to highlight a couple major events that led us from, I guess, past history to now, starting with when Sudan became an independent state. This is after nearly 60 years of joint British and Egyptian rule. There is a government, I guess, protest in the 60s and 64, and this is when Islam and the Islamic-based government took control. And then in the 70s, the South becomes a self-governing region. The country is typically split into Muslims and Christians, and so the South becoming a self-governing region is the split between those two major religions. And then oil is discovered in the South in the 70s, which of course leads to war. And then in 83, the President Numeri introduces Sharia Islamic law, which is different than Shiite, so it's a very specific Islamic law. And then, of course, there's another uprising in the 80s, and he is deposed. And then Omar al-Bashir, which is the most recent dictator, appoints himself president. He's not elected, he chooses himself in 93. It has been reigning pretty much ever since.
So to touch on the recent timeline, so starting in December of 2019, some riots broke in, it started in Abera, and it spread all over the country. And so, it was due to the economic crisis and the direct effect on the population, which was the tripling of the price of the bread. And so those riots, so here are basically became anti-government rallies very quickly. And so, it led to al-Bashir being forced out of power in April 2019, April 2019, and by the military. And so the army dissolved the government and suspended the constitution and decided to take charge of the country for 2 years. So that is why the victory was so short-lived by the people and why they continued protesting, because, the military basically helped them to overthrow the government, but then, the dictator to take his place right after. So on June 3rd, the Khartoum massacre, there was a sit-in in Khartoum outside of the Sudanese military headquarters, and the repression by the army was quite violent, and more than 100 people died, and there were a lot of injured and raped people, both men and women. And so on August 17th, surprisingly, the Transitional Military Council, so TMC, and the opposition, FFC, came to an agreement that they would share power for 3 years until a democratic election would be held. This latest shift suggests that Sudan is going towards an extensive political transition, but this is just an assumption, of course.
Okay, and here Sudan's leaders, they've had 4 leaders so far, just in 2019. So Omar al-Bashir was the dictator of Sudan for 30 years. Rule was marred by famine, conflict, and poverty. So he was deposed on April 11th, 2019, so this year. 2 days later, his right-hand man, Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, they call him Hemeti, becomes the deputy lead of transitional military government. And what's weird is that Hemeti was basically Omar's al-Bashir's right-hand man in the killings or the genocide of Darfur. So he was in charge of the coup, but he was al-Bashir's right-hand man. So obviously the public didn't like that. In August, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan basically takes Hemeti's place as head of the state. He's the chairman of the Sovereignty Council of Sudan, so transitional head of state. But basically, al-Burhan is Hemeti's puppet. He really has less power than Hemeti, which is crazy. And then in August 21st, the civilian prime minister is chosen, Abdullah Hamdok, who's an economist, and he is going to be the prime minister up until 2022, and then he's not allowed to run for election after that, for general elections.
Okay, so basically the slide is just about how obviously these protests are different and why they could succeed. There are 4 main reasons why these protests are different than the ones in the 60s and 80s. The first one is that there's a really new sense of Sudanese nationalism, and this is really not heard of in the country. You definitely have, I guess not you, but like people have more or feel more responsibility to their ethnicity than their nation. And so this can really be, I guess, exemplified. There was yeah, there was an attack on Sudanese citizens that was clearly the responsibility of the military, but the government blamed it on other Sudanese citizens. And so everyone was kind of like you're bullshitting us, this isn't true. And recognized that the military was trying to put, I guess, like responsibility on people that weren't actually responsible for it, and so they united against the government rather than turning on each other and turning on like fellow people. Access to social media and the internet. Obviously this wasn't around in the 60s or 80s, and this really gives people a voice and definitely empowers people whose voice has been taken by the government or who feel like they've just not had the opportunity to share it. So again, with the Blue for Sudan movement, that's how a lot of people found out about what was happening in Sudan. That's how I found out about how it happened. And so it really just gives more power to the people. Shared power during the transition. It's different because it's not, for this transition, one group of people isn't taking the place of another. It's the military, civilian representatives, and protesters representatives that are all sharing the power right now. The military is gonna have the lead or like take power first for about 22 months, and then it's going to be shared by the civilians and the protesters for the other 21, 18 months. Yeah, so a total of 3 years that they're going to share this power, and this is different, hasn't been done before. And then female leadership is also really important, not just because that when you have women protesting, you have more people protesting, but that women often are the backbone of these societies and often go unrecognized and unthanked. And so when you have women involved in this leadership and voicing their opinions that don't really voice them that often, it just gives more power to the people and shows how much more Sudanese citizens want democracy. Okay, so this is just our analysis of it. In the past, there's been military governments under al-Bashir, with civil war, corruption, and social and political unrest. Right now, we kind of tentatively called it a hybrid state just because it's mixed with civilian and military transitional council. And in the future, they are working towards a democratic state with civilian government, but this is also too early to tell just because the country is in a very fragile state right now, and honestly, our presentation could be completely wrong in a week if something goes wrong. So yeah, it's really early to tell.
Okay, so this is our conclusion. Sudan has an opportunity to embrace democratic transition and demand equality for all of its citizens. We believe it is too early to tell if Sudan's transition will be successful. The focus should instead be on whether the tools the Sudanese people have will be enough to instate a democracy. We think that the keys to a successful democratic transition will be keeping the peace, military relations. Obviously, the people that are in charge of the cabinet right now worked under al-Bashir during the genocide in Darfur, and the economy, they have a lot of inflation right now, and so they need to better their economy. Any questions? Nothing? Yes.
Can you go over to the slide of the conceptualizations of democracy?
Okay.
What I like is that, so it's hybrid right now, and could, according to your reading and today's class in general is about different theories have different lenses, and they might not take everything into account, but it's all we got, so let's just use it. And I really like that you put not only like authoritarianism on one side and liberal democracy on the other side, but also perhaps also more hybrid kinds of democracies or forms of government that exist there. So looking at this, yes, it's too early to tell whatever, but would you say it's a competitive authoritarian regime right now? Would you say it's going towards an electoral democracy, a liberal democracy? Could you reflect a bit more perhaps on the shades of gray that are there amongst the hybrid?
I think that during al-Bashir's dictatorship, it was definitely a competitive authoritarian regime because the country would hold elections, obviously, and he would win every time, but obviously that was because of intimidation and he would kill his opponents. Mm-hmm. And then I guess they're working on having an electoral democracy. Yeah, they're working on it, but it's just like while we were doing research on this, like we kept reading like articles that had just come out like hours before. You know, like this is something that's happening this right now.
Yeah. That's of course always the issue. Okay, no, but interesting.
No question? Do you guys want to know how many wives al-Bashir had? 2.
Oh.
Just 2. Okay, no questions. So let's see. Oh yeah.
Oh.
Is there sound?
Yeah, but let me later on tech support. That's okay.
Sorry.
Which sound do you want to?
Wait,
Yeah.
with the current prime minister, did you say he's allowed to be elected or not allowed?
No, he's not allowed.
Okay.
The people have said he's not allowed. He's only the transitional prime minister, so that he won't become a dictator. Yeah.
Yeah, we can. That's plenty. This is the volume button. Watch out. Yeah, no, okay.
Okay, so the video on the, we're going to show you 2 videos that are really quick. The video on the left will be, it's going to show the protesters demanding that al-Bashir step down. So this was April 8th, so before al-Bashir was deposed. And then the second video is after the agreement was signed with a mixed transitional government and the reaction of the people.
Just
Ah.
Okay. Oh. And then. Okay, so I don't know if you guys noticed in the second video, but the people were waving 2 different types of flags. One was the present Sudanese flag, and then the Sudanese flag that was from before the 70s when Sudan became was under Sharia law. And I just wanted to show how the current population wants an equal Sudan. Because the current flag is basically is just a pro-Arab flag, and so the people want a Sudan that's equal for everyone. It's filled with different ethnicities and religions and everything, and you can't just believe in just an Arab nation when it's not just an Arab nation. Yeah, do you guys think it's too early to tell if Sudan will become a democratic nation, or will it backslide into authoritarian rule like many other African nations? Will all this success be short-lived? What do you guys think?
I mean, honestly, looking at other African nations and even what happened right after they succeeded, I'm pretty sure that it's gonna fall into an authoritarian rule again. And even if it's gonna be called a democracy, it's not gonna be a democracy because there's just too many hands in Sudan, also with other Arab countries that have ties with the leaders that are there now. And I mean, it's really rare to have a democratic state, like especially after a coup, like that almost never
Yeah.
works out.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah.
Going off
Like
of
they-
that,
yeah.
like to add information to that,
Yeah.
with the whole like relationships with other Arab nations, Hamedi, who's basically like a sociopath,
Yeah.
like there's no other way to put it, like sold child soldiers to Yemen and Libya, and like Saudi Arabia is involved because there's oil in Sudan, and
Yeah,
you know
exactly.
Americans love oil, so like we wouldn't denounce Saudi Arabia if they're helping Sudan. So like there's just a lot of involvement of
Exactly.
actors. So yeah, it's going off of that.
Anyone else? Yeah.
I think my opinion is pretty much the same as her, but just adding to that, I think the fact that they just became something new, it's almost just like the first step, just the basis, and if you still have to, the entire country still have to adapt to what we could call a democracy. It's not just like the government, like whoever we elect that represents the politics in a country. The entire system, it's already working under what used to be an authoritarian state. So it takes a while, even for simple things as like the stores and people, like everything needs to adapt to a new type of politics. So it depends on how people are gonna take the steps towards the democracy, not just, okay, what the government is gonna do, but how society in general is gonna adapt to the new implications of what a democratic state will be.
Right.
So it's so hard to say. Like I can say from like my example, like Brazil used to be a military dictatorship, and I feel like we still have many signs from a dictatorship, even like 30 years later, was still adapting as a population to.
No, this is my second class. Oh, don't make it useless.
But yeah, it's
We know nothing about Brazil democracy. Let's discuss it later, okay?
But yeah, it takes time for people to adapt to a new type
Right.
of government.
Right. Anyone else? Yeah.
I'm also afraid that it's that what was the first leader again? I forgot his name.
Al-Bashir.
Yeah, Al-Bashir. Like he probably still has some power too. Like he's still puppeting things in Sudan, and even like his second man became the leader after the coup. So like obviously he's because he's also too powerful in relation to those Arab countries, and no one's really gonna do anything because of oil and resources and all of that. So
Yeah, no, the ICC wants to try him for war crimes, but the Sudanese government won't release him to get arrested. So they've tried him locally, and so he's just in prison in Sudan, just hanging out.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Yeah. Answering to you, I think that the people actually look like they want a democracy. I mean, I think maybe the main problem is gonna be like the army,
Right.
and then like the people in power. But I think the people on the streets actually want it. So I think but the people actually are capable to like adapt to a new democracy.
I'm not even saying about like what people want, I'm just saying that there are implications that even though we can be dying to a democracy, we really want it, there are things that are just too institutionalized, too ingrained in our like daily life that we don't even know that like are a consequence of an authoritarian state. So even if people are rooting for a democracy, even if we're working as a democracy, there are things that are just so ingrained that takes a long time to step away from. So I don't think it's a matter of like if people want it or not, just things that it's literally ingrained in every single aspect of life that we don't even notice just when we start to transition. But I think people want it, so it's a great
Yeah.
first step.
Yeah, the people want it, and I mean, the prime minister now is a civilian prime minister, so he's not gonna turn into a dictator. He's an economist. I don't think he's gonna like.
but that you never
I don't know. I feel like I don't think he wants like 20 palaces and like 5 wives. But yeah, that's not what's gonna change everything.
Yeah, so maybe, yeah. I didn't get that maybe, I don't know if you already said that, but what is like the importance of course, like, achievement in politics
Yeah.
is of course like the level of education. Like we are talking about people wanting a democracy, but like based on my background knowledge about Sudan in general, I'm not really too informed like about the level of education and civic education of people. Like, what I mean is that to implement a real change, it's important that all the population is truly involved and truly understand, like, not only the situation that they are in, but also the meaning of moving into another situation. What does it mean? Like, as you said, like, you don't think that the actual governor here is willing to become a dictator, but if people do not actually know what does it mean to be under a dictatorship rather than a democracy, because like even if it's like looking them as main concepts, it's easy to define them, but like during everyday life, like defining really what like your governors are actually doing to your country is not that easy, because it's like small steps every day that leads you to a situation at the end, like this, like the one of all the riots and whatever.
Yeah.
So like maybe it's important to understand that the means needed to create a democratic political environment are not only like politicians and corruption and whatever, but also like some works on the population of Sudan, on the education, on the infrastructure, on like all the surrounding environment in order to be like a good host for democracy. That's
Yeah.
what I think.
Yeah. No, the population is very young. Over 60% of the population is under 25. So most of them only have lived under the dictatorship of al-Bashir. So they don't know anything else other than the dictatorship. So I don't think they're educated enough to know like what a democracy is, but they just know that they don't want what they've had for the last 30 years. Yeah.
I would say, from what I can see, everything, there's no a specific figure that people look up to
Yeah.
to save their country.
Yeah, no.
They're all they have national solidarity with each other. So I would say that it is still early to say if it's going to be democratic, but I feel like the path that Sudan is going in, it's very likely that it's going to become a it's going to become a democratic state. I would argue that, because from previous examples, just looking with evidence, like after the colonial powers give independence to their like colonial countries like Myanmar, Zimbabwe, Sudan here, or like Libya, there was actually one person that people was looking up to save their country from like something like a disaster from colonial stuff. And here it's just the flag. It's just they only look up to one symbol, so it's very likely that they will cooperate together to rule it instead of focusing on that one person. Because if there's only one person, people accept that person to become the leader, but the leader would hang on, and that's what happened in the case of Colonel Gaddafi as well as Zimbabwe's Mugabe. Yeah, I would argue it that way.
Yeah, that's what we hope.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that the transition is very fragile, and that since it's easy to say that we don't want that we have known for 30 years, but it's difficult to then decide what is that we actually want.
Right.
So in elections, you will have two or more parties, so there will be some division, I think, again, and that will be easy to be exploited from people who have the power and want to preserve their rights to oil and whatever.
Right. We agree.
So it will be difficult.
Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah.
We're also talking about the tools that Sudan should if Sudan is ready for a democratic transition, talking about tools, and I guess that if there are many young people, there's a lot of workforce, and also Sudan, I know that there are many commerces between among Sudan and other big countries like Saudi Arabia or the Arab Emirates. So it has a potential to become as self-sustaining.